After a week full of political news featuring complex stories from the political fallout from Golders Green, a state visit in the USA, and some huge local election speculation, there's been a lot to follow. And if you've had a busy week or just don't follow the news, you've probably missed most of it. If that's you, or maybe you just want to know more about all this from a guy who has spent a little too long reading the news this week, then you're in the right place. This episode of the Roundup by News of the Week will explain all of the news as clearly and accessibly as possible, analyse all the big stories, and answer the outstanding questions from British politics news this week. First up, in policy change, there's not much to talk about because Parliament is currently in recess, so there's no votes on anything official until the 13th of May. There is still work going on in Parliament in the background, in committees and things like that, and there's been some policy news coming from outside of Parliament as well. For example, The Guardian reported that the Chancellor is considering partial private sector rent freezes in response to the Iran war. Now, the idea seems to be that it could address affordability concerns, given the uncertainty around the impact of the Iran war on energy prices and things like that. However, the article also included pretty sceptical reaction from the private rental sector, and in terms of feasibility, not only is Parliament currently prorogued, like I just said, it also doesn't seem like we're talking about very it doesn't seem like we're talking about very far developed plans here, and they have been shut down by ministers and spokespeople this week too. So this isn't so speculation like this isn't really on the horizon just yet. It's just media talk essentially. In news on foreign policy, this week saw the King's historic state visit to the USA go ahead, with loads of high-profile speeches and engagements, but no real answer to the question, has it improved the special relationship so far? Well, the King received praise on both sides of the Atlantic for his various speeches in the USA this week. In them, he talked about difficult aspects of the relationship, including Ukraine, Iran, tariffs and the British military, the environment, and all of that without drawing any real criticism from the Trump administration. At the end of his visit this week, Trump called Charles the greatest king in his book. He helped praise on his diplomatic capability and even announced a removal of tariffs on Scottish whisky as a gesture to the monarch. Now, Trump himself stopped short of saying the visit impacted the relationship between the two countries, further criticising Starmer's stance on Iran and saying that he has to learn how the way the king makes deals. But many analysing the impact of the last week were concerned that it brought nothing of substance to the relationship. It now has in the form of that tariff reduction, and arguably it's also demonstrated the closeness of the relationship and the ties between Britain and America that underline that relationship between its leaders. Analysis from Sky News, though, argued that the relationship between the two leaders is rocky, and to be honest, there's not much to refute that. Just because there are warm relations between the King and Trump, that doesn't mean it's automatically going to extend to Starmer. And also a sudden fixed special relationship, it doesn't work like that. So while the special relationship and its potential impact might have been showcased through the King and Trump's relationship, the relationship between Starmer and Trump hasn't actually changed very much at all. Moving on to general politics news, where this week saw a terror attack carried out in Golders Green in London. It was an attack on two men who were being treated in hospital as recently as this weekend following the attack. A man was arrested by the police who is still in custody and is being investigated by counter-terrorism police. The two men who were stabbed are expected to recover, with one being discharged already, but the event has had political consequences too, sparking speculation over Polanski's leadership and further questions of the Labour government. What happened? Well, this was a terror attack on two Jewish men in a Jewish community in London. And that's relevant later, but Polanski's part in this was he reposted a post on Twitter which claimed police officers were repeatedly and violently kicking a mentally ill man after he was already incapacitated. And the Met Police Commissioner Sir Mark Rowley wrote an open letter to Polanski, saying commentary disregarded the police officers' work and were contributing to rising tensions like the ones we're seeing building up against the Jewish community in this country, and he said that undermines police confidence. Rowley further criticised armchair critics who were commenting on police work, and although he said officers must be held accountable for any unfair use of force, Polanski's use of social media and his public profile to call for that were not the appropriate route for that to go down. Polanski's post or repost drew criticism from across British politics, with the Lib Dems and Labour both calling it disgraceful. Starmer himself said Polanski was not fit to lead a political party in this country, and that led to Polanski apologising for sharing the video in haste. He said reflection on police conduct take place, but that social media was not the right channel for it, and he added that he invited the Met Police Commissioner to discuss his issues with him. Aside from that, Starmer also drew criticism for not doing enough to curb anti-Semitism, with a protest coming outside of Downing Street and a multi-faith solidarity walk, all calling for further changes. On that, money has been allocated to improving the police responses in Jewish communities, and there is talk of changes in terms of pro-Palestine protests and cracking down on certain language being used, but at least on that arm of it, that hasn't happened yet. So for Polanski and the Greens, there's been a bit of a problem recently, with group chats exposing more alleged anti-Semitism of party members and questions being asked about Polanski's ability to actually lead the party. This could affect the Greens going forward, maybe at the local elections, but it's unlikely to result in Polanski being ousted at this stage, since criticism hasn't come from within the Greens, it's just come externally. There still seems to be a basis of support for the Greens at the moment. For Starmer, it further deepens his unstable position, but for all his instability and unpopularity, he's also not really imminently threatened in his current position either, because this is almost like just stacking on the pile. It's not enough to tear him down, it's just adding to the issues. But Starr's position has been in the news for other reasons this week, and it's a continuation of the Mandelson story yet again. Sky News said at the start of the week he was facing Judgment Day. The question is, can he keep on surviving? Well, this week has seen more interviews in Foreign Affairs Select Committee, which is currently inquiring over the vetting process from Lord Mandelson, and it poured further doubt on the claim that due process was followed in that vetting. For example, a former high-ranking official at the Foreign and Commonwealth Development Office, Sir Philip Barton, gave evidence to the Foreign Affairs Committee a week after Sir Ollie Robbins did the same thing. Barton said Number 10 was uninterested in Mandelson's vetting, wanting to know that practical steps are being taken, but not more than that. He also backed up Robbins' comments from last week that some in the department didn't think Mandelson needed to be vetted. And again, same as last week, he recounted pressure from Number 10 to clear the vetting, which he said was there from the start and was set after the ambition to have Mandelson in post before Trump's inauguration was outlined. Literally goes against Starmer's claims to MPs last week that no pressure was put on the vetting and that there was only the normal amount that comes with the job. McSweeney was also interviewed by the Foreign Affairs Select Committee this week, and he insisted he was not the only one who favoured Mandelson's appointment and that he did not oversee vetting or tell officials to skip steps. That is despite reports saying that Morgan McSweeney actually told Barton to just effing approve the appointment. Now, separate to this inquiry but relevant to the Mandelson story, Starmer was also tested in the Commons this week. This was with a vote over whether he should face the Privileges Committee to decide whether he was in contempt of Parliament, i.e. whether he lied to Parliament and whether it impacted Parliament's work, which is the remit of what the Privilege Committee investigates. It was a Tory motion approved by the Speaker and considered on Tuesday. For those who don't know, Labour forced its MPs to block it, and it failed as a consequence, with the government winning the vote and putting it down with a majority of 112. 15 Labour MPs voted for the motion, so against the government. It means that Starmer won't face the Privileges Committee over the claims he lied to Parliament, which means he also won't be investigated for that, and a potential breach of Parliament and a potential breach of Parliament's rules. He isn't going to face scrutiny on that basis right now. In a reaction to the vote going ahead, he told MPs that the vote was baseless and others called it a stunt. There were some accusations that it was coming to undermine Labour's electoral chances this week. Now, ministers supported him, with the Environment Secretary even defending him to the media, saying he did not lie to Parliament. After winning that vote, Starmer won't go over misleading Parliament in relation. Starmer's position won't go in relation to misleading Parliament. But it doesn't mean he's secure, because something I haven't mentioned on this podcast in the last few weeks is that at some point this vetting inquiry that we're covering with all of the with all of interviews from former high-ranking people will conclude, and that could apply pressure to Starmer again over the same issue if it concludes that there there was an issue with the vetting process. Given his weak parliamentary position, which we'll talk about in a minute, any renewed pressure could put Starmer back in hot water. So although he's not going to face an investigation from Parliament over a possible breach and misleading and impeding its work, he could face further pressure in the future when this inquiry into the vetting concludes. The thing is, as well, is Starmer isn't all of a sudden. The thing is that Starmer isn't all of a sudden secure within his party either, with The Guardian covering reports this week that factions on the left and right of the Labour Party are preparing documents that would demand Starmer to either commit to stepping down on a certain date or allow Burnham, who's currently the Manchester mayor and who was blocked earlier on this year from going back to the Commons, to return to the Commons. It has been thought that Starmer would go with poor results anyway, and that's been a widely held view for months and months. So rather than winning the vote on the Privileges Committee, meaning he's safe, Keir Starmer is not out of the woods yet, not at all. Moving on to stats and trends, though, being so close to the local elections, I thought it would be silly not to discuss some local election predictions. And speaking of, ITV News asked the question, are the May elections the beginning of the end for the two big parties? The article noted the results from Labour and the Tories, which are Britain's established two main parties, just because of how much they've won, are predicted to be bad across the whole of the UK. Polling shows that in Wales it's Plaid Cymru versus Reform, in Scotland it's the SNP versus Labour or Reform, and in England Reform are still out in front in the polls, but everyone else is pretty much level. So what the article is based on is that there is splits in support for minor parties now in polling, which we haven't seen very often at all. ITV News noted Labour is losing voters because of their record in government, and the Conservatives are being punished for their time in office. However, it also noted voters aren't really crossing left and right blocks, and that there is just increasing fragmentation within their side. So Conservative voters are going to Reform and sometimes vice versa, but they're sticking on that right-wing bloc, and it's the same for the Labour voters on the left. Essentially, the article notes that Labour and Conservative voters are no longer dominant on their sides, but it stopped short of saying it's the end and that it would be decided. And they said actually that it would be decided by whether voters were turning their backs for good. Conveniently, that's not an answer to the question because we don't know whether they're turning their backs for good. But they did note that fragmentation has happened before, just not as often and or as quickly as it is now, which contributes to the arguments that the two parties are dead. Well, but the much needed context here is that the polls aren't gospel, and right at this second, it's impossible to tell how. Right at this second, it's impossible to tell how much of the fragmentation or the split on and the split between parties is a result of voters' frustration, which could be temporary, rather than a genuine belief in a cluster around a party. So while there are questions over the big parties, and then also while there are questions over the big parties because of their records, there are also questions over the Greens, Reform, the SNP, implied from accusations over anti-Semitism with the Greens, Reform, racism within Reform, a poor record in government from both Plaid and the SNP. They're all issues that are outstanding that could affect them as well going forward. Now, ultimately, the only thing that's clear and the only answer you can get to these questions at the moment is that there are heightened levels of uncertainty in British politics, which is significant going into local elections, and that means that and given we're now 4 days away, you'd expect the polls to be more and more accurate. But it's actually but overall, in future elections, not just this one, it's too early to tell whether it's the end of Labour or the Tories. So let's zoom out. This week has seen speculation over rent caps. It's seen a state visit, terrorist attack, and political fallout from it. There's been more fallout from the Mandelson vetting process and Starmer has only half come away from that stronger. Then there's been some pretty definitive local election claims. And that's the end of this week's roundup by News of the Week. If you liked it, please remember to like and subscribe and comment so you can see this show next week too. And comment with what you thought about my reaction to some of these stories or the stories themselves. And remember to check out newsoftheweek.net for the text version of this episode where you can see all of my sources and the written explanation of everything that's going on.